So now you have to wait a little bit until you can ask questions from Andreas. You have to endure my presentation, but I try to be fast. Michael mentioned the difference between anti-pluralism and populism. Now, I'm interested in exactly this kind of differences. And I would call them varieties of illiberalism, using a little bit different terminology, but basically meaning the same. The point that is behind the Outlib project that I represent here is that in different countries, liberal democracy is challenged in a different way. And let's try to map these different challenges, because we need to give different answers to different challenges. When you look at elite discourse, you find certain ways of arguing against liberal democracy. And then the next step is to find out whether these arguments are present in the public as well. So what are the major challenges, ideologically speaking, to liberal democracy? I would first identify 5 major frames that are often used in has been used in the past and used today by various elite actors: authoritarianism, populism, traditionalism, religious fundamentalism, and nativism, nationalism. In brackets, you can see some of the authors from the past and present who contribute to these arguments and who therefore represent a variety, a version of illiberalism. There are 4 additional ways to question liberal democracy. Those additional ways are perhaps not as relevant as these 5 main roads to illiberalism, but in certain geographic or temporal spaces, they can become actually even more relevant. And these are paternalism, libertarianism, materialistic, and left-wing illiberalism. All these 4 have some kind of internal contradiction, but they can be very powerful and consequential. We have conducted last year surveys in 7 countries where we focused on the 5 major challenges to illiberalism, and we try to find out how much difference they make when it comes to party choice. Here you see the list, the way how we measure these 5 versions of illiberalism. These are fairly standard items, so I don't want to spend much time on them. It's interesting that there was one orientation, nationalism, nativism nationalism, that we decided to measure with 2 scales. One, the more kind of classical nationalism, which is about the exaggerated pride in your country, disregarding international principles, and in European context being against European integration. But we measured separately xenophobia. And it turned out to be consequential, because the 2 scales, although both of them have something to do with nativism and nationalism, they correlated with each other at 0.29, which is not particularly large correlation. Authoritarianism is perhaps the type of illiberalism that we could most justifiably call anti-democracy. It contains some classical authoritarian items like obedience, punitiveness, but also worshipping leaders who want to bend the law. And finally, we had 2 not perfect items to measure religious fundamentalism. So the question was, which of these patterns is present in our 7 countries? We ran our survey in 7 countries. And here you see that with blank white, we represent cases when the sentiment was below average, and with stronger red when it was very robustly present. As you can see, populism is particularly strong in Hungary and Italy, somewhat weaker in Poland. Traditionalism is widespread in Czechia, in Hungary, and in Poland. Authoritarianism was surprisingly strong in France. We try to measure authoritarianism in other ways as well, just to check whether there is something wrong with our items. But in whatever way we measured, France stood out in terms of being an authoritarian country when it comes to the survey responses. To a lesser extent, we found authoritarianism in Italy as well. Nationalism was particularly strong in Czechia and Poland, and it was very weak in Hungary. But then Hungary came on the top when it came to xenophobia, together with Czechia. And finally, religious fundamentalism strongest in Poland and weaker in Britain and in Italy. By the way, in case of Britain, some of this comes from Orthodox and Muslim and other religious minorities. Then we looked at, I wish I had Winnie the Pooh type of graphs on there, so it's a bit more boring than that, but we looked at how vote choice is reflected by these attitudes, and the ranking of these attitudes is as follows. Religious fundamentalism and populism don't really matter when it comes to party choice. Authoritarianism and xenophobia a bit more. Traditionalism much more, and then nationalism is the one that seems to be the most consequential. Just to have a contrast, we present here answers to the economic question of redistribution, and you can see economic left-right redistributionism matters much less than any of the cultural orientations. Then the next question was how, to what extent these ideologies make a difference between illiberal parties and non-illiberal parties. Later I can explain how we decided which party is illiberal, which party is not. But the bottom line is that nationalism and traditionalism are on the top, quite similarly, by the way, to the general party choice question. And again, populism and religious fundamentalism are much less consequential. Then the novelty of the current analysis is that we added a battery of questions referring to culture war topics. So that these days you cannot even say what you think about immigrants, women, or gays. What our society needs is protection against international influence, not further opening up. These days, the leading contribution of white people is downplayed. Teaching teenagers about tolerance towards transgender and homosexual minorities can cause harm. And it is impossible for an organization to serve the interests of our nation if most of its funding comes from foreign resources. This is a major issue right now in Hungary, by the way, and the major excuse for a clampdown on civil society. And what we found is that some of these items are surprisingly widespread, particularly I think the next slide is about it, that you cannot speak about minorities freely today. That resonated well across many countries. Now, in general, this backlash, cultural backlash, is particularly strongly related to nationalism and traditionalism. And as indeed this graph says, the item that you cannot today speak freely is accepted by more than 60% of the population in the countries that we examine. It's particularly strongly present in Czechia and Poland, but also Britain. And interestingly, it's rejected in Austria and Italy. This is a different configuration than the others. So although culture war attitude correlates with traditionalism and nationalism, it is not identical with that. It provides a different pattern than those. And in that regard, it probably needs to be added to the analysis of political behavior. And this table shows that culture war attitudes correlated higher than most with party choice than most other orientations. And they correlated higher with the division between liberalism and illiberalism, or whether you vote for illiberal parties or not. And finally, given that trust is such an important issue today, we looked at how it's related to how these orientations are related both to institutionalized trust, trust in democratic institutions, and in personal trust. And here, finally, we see that populism makes a big difference. So populism is the one that undermines institutional trust more. We also find that religious fundamentalism actually increases trust, has the opposite impact than the others. But you also see that when it comes to interpersonal trust, then the culture war attitudes are the most detrimental. So these attitudes make a huge difference when it comes to the type of integration of our society that Andreas was also speaking about. So thanks a lot for your attention.